A modern flight recorder has to survive an impact force of 3,400 times the pull of gravity. That is roughly like dropping a 230 kilogram weight from 3 meters aimed at a single point the size of a coin. It also has to survive fire at over 1,000 degrees Celsius for a full hour. Then, it has to survive months underwater, crushed under pressure, 6,000 meters deep. That is deeper than most of the entire ocean floor has ever been mapped in fine detail. So once a plane goes down, how does this device actually make its way from twisted wreckage back into a lab? And how much of the truth inside it actually survives the trip? The idea for a recorder like this only exists because investigators once had almost nothing to go on. In 1953, the world's first commercial jet airliner, the Comet, began crashing under mysterious circumstances with no survivors and no explanation. Most people call it one box, but there are really two. The flight data recorder tracks dozens of technical readings from altitude to airspeed to every control input a pilot makes. The cockpit voice recorder captures the last 2 hours of sound inside the cockpit, looping over itself once that window fills up. Both devices sit in the tail section of the aircraft, statistically the part most likely to survive intact. These recorders have been mandatory on American commercial aircraft since 1967, built to strict international standards ever since. An underwater locator beacon rides along on each unit too, a small pinger triggered automatically the moment water touches its sensor. That pinger transmits a signal detectable from 2 to 4 kilometers away. Its battery lasts anywhere from 30 to 90 days before it finally goes silent. Investigators recover the wreckage first, then place each recorder inside a secure, tracked container. In especially sensitive crashes, that container travels under armed police escort, exactly as happened after Air France Flight 447 went down in 2009. If a recorder spent time underwater, technicians keep it submerged in fresh water on the trip to the lab. That step washes away corrosive salt before anyone dares open the casing. If water has already seeped inside the unit, engineers dry it slowly inside a vacuum oven. That drying process alone can take hours, sometimes stretching into days. From there, the recorder heads to a specialized national facility, often the NTSB lab in Washington or a country's own dedicated aviation safety bureau. India's own investigation bureau handled a recent domestic crash this way. The entire chain of custody stayed inside the country rather than shipping the recorder abroad. Technicians carefully extract the memory core, the single most important surviving piece of the entire aircraft. Data gets downloaded, and the flight data timeline gets synchronized second by second against the cockpit audio. A multi-party team then reviews everything together. That team usually includes airline representatives, the manufacturer, government safety investigators, and sometimes even a language specialist for audio in an unfamiliar dialect. Every party in that room often has competing interests in what the recordings actually reveal. That is exactly why no single one of them reviews the data alone. Full interpretation of everything recovered can take weeks, sometimes stretching into months. International rules under ICAO Annex 13 keep the actual cockpit audio itself extremely restricted. The public normally only ever gets a written transcript, specifically to protect the privacy of the crew who died making it. Here's the part nobody tells you about how bulletproof this system actually is in practice. The official promise behind every recorder is simple. These devices are engineered to be almost indestructible, so the truth is always recoverable in the end. In August of 2012, a Malaysia Airlines Boeing 747 suffered a serious engine failure shortly after takeoff from London Heathrow. The crew handled the emergency well and landed the aircraft safely, with everyone on board unharmed. But investigators later discovered the cockpit voice recorder had kept running after the plane landed. Recording on a 2-hour loop, it simply taped over every second of the actual emergency before anyone thought to pull the breaker. British investigators ruled the airline's procedures for preserving recordings were, in their own words, not sufficiently robust. Not a mechanical failure, not a design flaw in the recorder itself, not anything the crash-proof engineering was ever built to prevent in the first place. The official language treats these recorders as a guarantee that answers always survive a serious incident. The fuller reality is that a recorder surviving fire and pressure means nothing if a human simply forgets to switch it off in time. Roughly a year and a half later, that same airline's flight MH370 disappeared over the Indian Ocean, and its recorder was never recovered at all. Search crews spent years combing tens of thousands of square kilometers of open ocean, one of the most extensive aviation searches ever conducted. An indestructible box still depends entirely on somebody finding it or somebody remembering to preserve it once it lands back on solid ground. The same airline sits at the center of both failures 18 months apart. That 2-hour recording limit on the voice recorder has drawn criticism for decades. Investigators have identified more than a dozen incidents since 2003 alone where a longer recording would have helped explain what actually happened. Regulators finally responded in 2026, requiring new aircraft to carry cockpit voice recorders capable of holding 25 hours of audio instead of 2. Existing aircraft still have until the end of the decade to be retrofitted with the same upgrade. The strangest part of this entire story goes all the way back to who invented the device in the first place. An Australian scientist named David Warren lost his own father in a 1934 plane crash when David was only 9 years old. His father's last gift to him was a simple crystal radio set, which sparked a lifelong fascination with electronics. Decades later, while investigating a string of mysterious jet crashes in the 1950s, Warren proposed building a recorder for cockpits. His own boss reportedly hated the idea when he first suggested it. He built a working prototype in 1956, but Australian officials rejected the idea outright. One official Air Force letter dismissed his invention, claiming it would yield, in their words, more expletives than explanations. After a separate fatal crash in 1960, a judge explicitly recommended these recorders finally be installed in commercial aircraft. Even then, Australia's own civil aviation department chose to purchase a competing American system instead of Warren's own design. That American system then proved completely useless in the very next crash investigation it was needed for. It took a visiting British aviation official spotting the prototype in Warren's own lab before the idea finally traveled overseas and took hold. The man who invented the device, now sitting on every commercial aircraft on Earth, was dismissed by his own country for years. So the answer to where a black box actually goes is less about the box and more about the people handling it. The engineering itself has never really been the weak point, tested against heat, pressure, and force far beyond anything else on the plane. Every failure that has ever mattered happened around the box instead, a breaker left running, an idea dismissed for years before anyone finally listened. That same pattern makes you wonder what actually happens to a shipwreck once searchers finally locate it on the ocean floor. This kind of hidden system is the sort of thing you can keep seeing unpacked stage by stage. Somewhere right now, a recorder just like this one is quietly logging a completely uneventful flight, doing its job by never being needed at all. Subscribing keeps the next one coming.